The night was already tense when the ambulance doors slammed open at the hospital. Rainwater dripped onto the floor as two paramedics rushed in a man covered in blood. His clothes were torn, his breathing uneven, and his face pale from pain. Beside the stretcher, a large military dog moved with sharp focus. Its eyes never left the man. The paramedics shouted for space. Nurses ran forward, pushing equipment and clearing the path to the emergency room. The dog stayed close, walking step by step of the stretcher, its body stiff and alert. One of the paramedics tried to pull the leash to slow the dog down, but it refused to move back. "He won't leave him," the paramedic said. He was like this the whole ride. Inside the emergency room, the noise rose quickly. Machines beeped. Shoes squeaked against the floor. The man on the stretcher wore a torn uniform with no clear markings, but something about him stood out. His posture, even while injured, carried discipline. His hands were rough, scarred, and strong. This was not an ordinary patient. A senior doctor stepped forward, calm and confident. He wore a white coat and a badge that showed military symbols. He spoke with authority and told the staff he would take control of the case. "I've worked with soldiers before," the doctor said. "I'll handle this." As soon as he moved closer, the dog growled. The sound was low, deep, and full of warning. The room fell quiet for a moment. People froze. The doctor stopped and looked at the dog with surprise. "It's fine," the doctor said. "Animals get stressed in hospitals." He took another step. The dog lunged. In one sudden movement, the dog snapped forward and bit the doctor's arm. The doctor screamed and stumbled back. Blood spread quickly on the white sleeve of his coat. Nurses shouted. Security rushed in. Someone grabbed the dog's leash, pulling it away with force. The injured man on the stretcher moved weakly. His eyes opened for a second. His lips parted, like he was trying to say something, but no sound came out. His hand lifted slightly, pointing not at the dog, but toward the doctor. Then he passed out again. The room exploded into chaos. The doctor was taken aside for treatment. Security tried to calm everyone down. The dog was held firmly, but it didn't fight. It stood still, eyes locked on the doctor, ears raised, breathing steady. "That dog is dangerous," someone said. "It needs to be removed." But one young nurse hesitated. She had been standing near the corner of the room, holding supplies, watching everything unfold. She was new, still learning the rhythm of the hospital, still getting used to the pressure. Most people barely noticed her, but she noticed the dog. It wasn't acting wild. It wasn't out of control. The moment the doctor was out of sight, the dog relaxed slightly. It sat down near the stretcher and lowered its head, staying close to the injured man. The nurse felt something twist in her stomach. Dogs trained for military work were taught discipline. They didn't attack without reason. And this one had attacked only one person. The patient was moved to a private room under heavy watch. Security stood outside the door. The dog was allowed to stay inside, lying on the floor near the bed, eyes half closed but never fully resting. Later that night, the same doctor returned, his arm wrapped in thick bandages. His face was tight with anger, but his voice stayed calm. "I need access to the patient," he said. "This situation involves national security." The nurse was assigned to assist him. As she walked beside the doctor, she noticed how he avoided looking at the dog. His steps slowed near the door. When the dog lifted its head and stared at him, the doctor stopped. "It should be restrained," he said. The nurse nodded but didn't move right away. She checked the patient's monitor instead. His heart rate was unstable, but improving. His breathing was still shallow. The doctor stepped closer to the bed. The dog stood up, not growling, not barking, just standing. The nurse felt the tension fill the room again. Her hands tightened around the clipboard she was holding. The doctor cleared his throat. "Please," he said, "I know what I'm doing." As he reached toward the patient, the nurse saw something fall from his coat pocket. A badge slid across the floor and stopped near her shoe. She bent down and picked it up. At first glance, it looked official. Metal, heavy, military symbols etched into the surface. But something fell off. The symbols were unfamiliar. The wear on the badge looked forced, like it had been scratched on purpose to appear old. She handed it back to him. The doctor took it quickly, almost too quickly, and shoved it back into his pocket. "Be careful," he said. "That's important." The nurse nodded, but her mind was racing. Her brother had served years ago. She remembered him talking about badges, ranks, and how small details mattered. The way symbols were placed. The way numbers were stamped. This badge didn't feel right. The dog let out a soft sound, almost a warning. The doctor froze. The nurse looked at the patient again. His fingers twitched slightly. His face tightened like he was dreaming, or remembering something painful. She leaned closer and heard him whisper one word under his breath. "No." That was all. The doctor straightened up and forced a smile. "He's unstable," he said. "I'll return later." He left the room quickly. The nurse stayed behind. She stood quietly, listening to the steady beeping of the monitor. The dog lay back down, calm once more. She looked at the door the doctor had walked through. For the first time since starting her job, she felt certain of one thing. Something was very wrong, and the dog knew it long before anyone else did. The nurse stayed at the bedside, her eyes on the patient and the dog lying close to him. The dog's presence was steady, almost comforting. The patient's breathing had evened slightly, but his face still showed pain. The nurse moved quietly, checking his vitals, adjusting the monitor, and making sure the 4 lines stayed secure. She had learned early that rushing could create more problems than solved. Night at the hospital was always busy, but this room felt different. The energy was heavy, charged. Every so often, the patient would twitch, and the nurse would lean in to ensure he wasn't in more pain than necessary. The dog, alert even while lying down, would shift slightly to block any person patient did not recognize. She had been assigned to watch him overnight. She had expected to simply monitor, keep him comfortable, and let the doctors take care of everything. But after what had happened with the bite, she knew this patient's story was more complicated. Several hours passed. The emergency lights in the hallway hummed faintly, and the occasional footsteps of security and nurses echoed outside the room. She checked the patient's pulse again, noticing how it jumped slightly whenever anyone approached the door. Finally, the doctor returned, though the nurse noticed something different this time. He walked slower, his face tight, and he avoided looking at the dog. He tried to act confident, but she could see the tension in his hands. He approached the patient, clearly expecting to take control again. Before he reached the bed, she spoke softly. "Should I restrain the dog?" He shook his head quickly. "No, it's fine. Just stay out of the way." The nurse felt uneasy. Something about the way he said it didn't match the calm, confident tone he had used earlier. She kept her distance, watching every move. The dog growled faintly when the doctor came closer. It was not an angry growl, but a warning. Protective, intelligent, the kind of warning a trained animal gives when it senses danger. The doctor bent over the patient, speaking quietly. The patient stirred, whispering words a nurse could not understand. He gestured weakly at the doctor. The nurse noticed how the doctor reacted, almost flinching. Then the patient's hand dropped back to the bed. The nurse moved closer to pick up supplies from a nearby tray and noticed the badge again. It had fallen from the doctor's pocket earlier, and it was lying near her foot. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It looked real at first, metallic and official, but she remembered her brother's stories about the small details. How some badges had marks that identified real service members. This one had inconsistencies, small scratches that looked deliberate, symbols that didn't match any known unit. Her stomach tightened. She had to be careful. The last thing she wanted was to make a mistake, but she knew something was wrong. The dog shifted, lifting its head to watch the doctor. It seemed to sense her thoughts. It let out a low whine, almost as if confirming her suspicion. The nurse quietly followed the doctor when he moved to adjust the patient's fore. She kept her distance, but kept her eyes on him. When he reached for a drawer to get some supplies, she noticed he hesitated. Something in his movements seemed deliberate, careful, watching, calculating. As he leaned over to place the items on the tray, the nurse saw a small, folded note fall from his pocket. She did not touch it. She only noticed it and stored it in her mind. It seemed like a hidden message, something he did not want anyone else to see. Hours passed in silence except for the monitor beeps and the patient's shallow breathing. The The nurse checked the room periodically, ensuring the dog was calm and the patient stable. She could feel the dog's focus shift slightly toward her. It was as if it trusted her, or at least recognized that she was paying attention. She began reviewing the patient's chart. It was sparse, incomplete. The incident report from the emergency room mentioned the bite, but it did not contain information about the patient's background or the real cause of the injury. There were gaps, large gaps. She started making notes of everything she noticed: the dog's behavior, the patient's reactions, and the doctor's inconsistencies. Later, a nurse from another floor came in to check on routine medications. The young nurse asked her quietly, "Have you ever seen a military badge like this?" The other nurse glanced at it and shook her head. "No, that doesn't look familiar. Military badges are very specific. You can tell which branch and unit just by the marks." The young nurse felt a chill. She knew her instincts were right. Something about this doctor was off. The patient's dog knew it. The patient himself seemed to know it, even while unconscious. And now, this badge confirmed her suspicions. She decided she had to keep watching carefully. Not only was the patient in danger from his injuries, but something else, something hidden, was threatening him. She felt a mix of fear and determination. She was new, but she knew she could not ignore what was happening. In the middle of the night, the patient stirred again. His eyes opened slightly, and he focused on her. He whispered weakly, "Protect him." The nurse glanced at the dog, which had already stiffened, and moved closer to the patient. She realized the dog had understood the same thing. The doctor was a threat. The young nurse's heart pounded. She felt a responsibility she had never experienced before. She stayed by the bedside, monitoring both the patient and the doctor's actions. The doctor, now aware of her attention, tried to act natural, but she could see the tension in his movements. Time passed slowly. The night seemed endless. She checked the patient again, adjusted his blanket, and let the dog sit near her feet while watching the doctor. The badge had been returned to the doctor's pocket, but she could not stop thinking about it. Something was hidden, something important. The nurse stayed alert. Every sound, every movement mattered. The patient's breathing, the dog's reactions, the doctor's gestures, all of it formed a story that she was beginning to understand. The pieces were scattered, but she could feel the truth beneath the surface. When the first light of morning seeped into the room, she realized she had spent the entire night paying close attention. Exhaustion weighed on her body, but she did not step away. She knew that by watching, by noticing, she might have already prevented something terrible from happening. The doctor left briefly to consult with another physician. The nurse stayed behind, alone with the patient and the dog. She leaned over and whispered, "I'll keep you safe." The dog's ears flicked, as if acknowledging her words. The patient's hand twitched slightly. It was a small gesture, but it felt like trust. She realized that sometimes the smallest acts, paying attention, staying alert, noticing what others overlook, could change everything. She had always thought being a nurse was about medicine and treatment, but tonight she learned it was also about awareness and intuition. The badge, the dog, the patient, the suspicious doctor. It was a puzzle, and she had just begun to piece it together. The night had been long, tense, and confusing, but she felt certain of one thing. She could not let her guard down. The real challenge was only beginning, and she had to be ready. The next morning, the nurse returned to hospital early, still thinking about the events of the previous night. Her mind raced as she recalled every detail. The patient's weak gestures, the dog's protective behavior, and the suspicious badge the doctor had tried to hide. She knew she had to stay alert. Something wasn't right, and she couldn't ignore it. The hospital corridors were quiet at this hour. Most of the staff had not yet arrived, and the lights reflected off the polished floors. The nurse moved quickly but carefully, checking in at the nurse's station before heading back to the patient's room. The dog was already awake, sitting near the bed, its eyes focused and intelligent. It wagged its tail slightly when it saw her, but there was no sense of relaxation in its movements. The tension was still there, ready to rise if needed. She entered the room, greeting the patient softly. He blinked slowly and tried to smile, but the effort was clear in his eyes. His hand twitched slightly toward the dog, and the dog responded by moving closer, a quiet shield between him and any potential threat. The nurse felt a surge of admiration for the animal. It was more than just a pet. It was trained, loyal, and deeply aware of danger. As she checked his vitals, she noticed that his heart rate spiked slightly whenever the doctor appeared on her monitoring screen. The doctor was walking down the hall, clipboard in hand, pretending to make rounds. But the nurse could tell from the patient's reactions that he was not here simply to provide care. There was something else he wanted. She remembered the badge again. She had not stopped thinking about it. Something about it had seemed wrong, almost deliberately misleading. Her instincts were screaming that the patient was at risk, and she was the only one who could see it clearly. She could not rely on anyone else to notice the small but important signs. Determined, she took a moment to review the patient's records more closely. The reports were incomplete and strangely vague. No clear documentation of his military unit or the incident that had brought him here. The gaps were significant. Every piece of missing information made her more suspicious of the doctor and his intentions. Later that day, she noticed a subtle change in the patient's breathing. He was restless, shifting slightly in the bed, his eyes scanning the room as if aware that he was not alone. She leaned closer and whispered, "It's okay. I'm here. We'll keep you safe." The dog responded immediately, standing up and moving to place itself between the patient and the door. Its posture was defensive but calm, ready to act if needed. The nurse felt a strange sense of relief. The dog trusted her, and in a way, she trusted it. Together, they were guardians for someone who could not defend himself. Hours passed with small, tense movements. The doctor returned, this time trying to appear casual, but the nurse noticed the subtle changes in his behavior. He hesitated near the doorway, his eyes flicking toward the dog, then quickly away. His smile did not reach his eyes. The nurse's instincts told her that he had realized she was paying attention, and that her observation threatened whatever plan he had. She took a deep breath and decided it was time to act carefully. She could not confront him openly yet, but she could gather evidence, pay close attention, and protect the patient in small ways that would make a difference. Every small observation mattered. The way the doctor moved, what he said, the gestures he made, even the way he interacted with hospital equipment. As the day went on, the patient stirred more frequently. He was weak, but his eyes were bright, as if trying to communicate something urgent. The nurse leaned closer, catching fragments of words, barely audible. "Not safe, badge him." Her heart raced. The fragments were enough. They confirmed her fears that the doctor was not who he claimed to be, and that the patient's life could be in danger if she did not remain vigilant. She decided to take a careful look at the badge again when the doctor stepped out to speak with another nurse. She retrieved it from where it had been left on a counter, inspecting it closely. Every detail seemed slightly off. The engraving too deep, the symbols mismatched, the edges uneven. She compared it to pictures she remembered seeing from her brother's military service. This was not authentic. The more she examined it, the more certain she became. The dog's low growl interrupted her thoughts. She looked up and saw the patient shifting, his eyes locking on her. He tried to speak but could only whisper, "Trust dog." The nurse nodded, understanding. She would follow the dog's lead. Together, they would protect him. By evening, the doctor returned again, carrying charts and talking to himself quietly. The nurse kept a careful eye on him. The dog's movements mirrored her suspicions. Alert, tense, ready to act. Every step the doctor took was measured. Every glance seemed calculated to hide his intentions. She kept notes secretly, documenting everything she observed. The patient's reactions, the dog's warnings, the doctor's suspicious actions, and the inconsistencies in his badge. She knew that if she could prove the doctor was a fraud, she could protect the patient and perhaps others who might fall into his trap. During a brief moment when the doctor stepped away, the patient stirred again. His eyes were tired, but he seemed to trust her completely. He whispered again, almost a plea, "Find out truth." The nurse felt a mix of fear and determination. She was still new to the job, but she realized that her role in this room was more than routine care. It was protection, observation, vigilance, and she was the only one who could fulfill it right now. The night fell once more, and the nurse stayed close to the patient and the dog. She reviewed her notes again, comparing them to what she remembered about military badges and behavior. The dog's protective instincts, the patient's subtle signals, and the doctor's inconsistent actions all painted a clear picture. Danger was real and it was close. The dog laid its head on the bed, eyes still open, watching every movement. The nurse sat nearby, ready to respond. She understood now that the patient's life depended on small, careful actions, noticing the little details, staying alert, and trusting instincts over appearances. Hours passed slowly, the tension never fully leaving the room. The nurse felt a strained connection to the dog and the patient. She realized that even though she was new, her attention and awareness had made a difference. She had prevented harm the night before, and now she could continue to keep the patient safe. In the quiet hours before dawn, the patient's hand twitched toward her. She held it gently, feeling the trust and desperation in that simple gesture. The dog shifted closer, ears perked, ready to defend. The nurse whispered softly, "We'll get through this. I promise." The room was silent, except for the soft beeping of the monitors. The doctor was gone for now, and the nurse remained vigilant, aware that the next encounter could change everything. She understood that protection was not just about medicine. It was about awareness, instinct, and acting when others were blind to danger. As the first light of morning began to filter through the blinds, the nurse felt exhausted but determined. The patient was safe for the moment, the dog still alert, and she had begun to understand the larger story hidden behind the badges, the injuries, and the quiet warnings. It was a puzzle, and she was learning to see the pieces clearly. She knew the real test was coming. The doctor would return. The danger would rise again. But she felt a growing confidence, strengthened by the trust of the patient and the dog. Together, they had a chance to uncover the truth and protect someone who could not defend himself. And that knowledge gave her strength to face whatever was coming next. By late afternoon, the tension in the hospital room had thickened. The nurse had been watching the patient for hours, quietly observing every movement, every flicker of the dog's ears, every subtle reaction the patient made. She knew the doctor would return, and when he did, she had to be ready. The small hints, the inconsistencies, the strange behavior, it was all adding up. Something was wrong, and the patient's safety depended on her noticing it. The doctor returned just as the sun began to set, carrying a stack of folders and speaking quietly to himself. His steps were careful, almost too careful. The nurse noticed how he glanced at the dog and immediately averted his eyes, as though trying to ignore it. She remembered the bite from the night before. The dog had not attacked without reason. Its instincts were sharp, and it had already made its warning clear. The nurse moved closer to the bed, her presence a shield for the patient. The dog stood and shifted slightly, blocking the doctor's path. The patient stirred weakly, his eyes opening just enough to focus on the nurse and the dog. He whispered something, barely audible, and the nurse leaned in. "Not safe," he breathed. The nurse's heart skipped a beat. The fragments were enough to confirm what she already suspected. The doctor was not who he claimed to be. The badge, the behavior, the subtle hints, it all pointed deception. She could not confront him directly, not yet, but she could act quietly to protect the patient and gather proof. As the doctor reached for the patient's chart, the nurse observed him closely. He flipped through the pages with exaggerated care, taking notes but leaving gaps. She noticed his eyes darting repeatedly toward the patient, as if calculating what to do next. The dog's low growl rose slightly, a soft warning, and the nurse felt a surge of adrenaline. She understood the language of the dog and the patient's subtle signals. Danger was present. The nurse decided to quietly retrieve the badge once more while the doctor stepped out to answer a call. She examined it carefully, comparing it to her mental notes. Every detail seemed off. The engraving was deep in some areas and shallow in others. Symbols were misaligned, and the edges were uneven. It was a fake. She felt a chill run down her spine, realizing that this doctor gained access to a vulnerable patient by deception. Determined, she contacted hospital administration discreetly. She explained the situation without revealing too much, emphasizing the inconsistencies and the need for verification. The administrators agreed to reach out to the proper authorities to confirm the doctor's credentials. It was a slow process, but it gave her a sense of direction. She would not confront the doctor alone. Back in the room, The patient's condition required attention. His breathing had become shallow at times, and the nurse carefully monitored the monitors, adjusted oxygen levels, and reassured him with a soft voice. The dog remained close, a loyal protector. The patient's weak gestures communicated trust and reliance, and the nurse felt a deep responsibility to remain vigilant. The doctor returned after some time, unaware that his credentials were under scrutiny. He approached with a calm but forced demeanor, attempting to maintain authority. The nurse noticed the tension in his posture, the subtle hesitation in his movements. He glanced at the dog, which stood alert, then quickly looked away. Every interaction became a careful observation. The nurse documented his behavior secretly. The way he moved, the words he used, the gestures he made, and the discrepancies in his explanations. She knew that evidence would be critical if she needed to prove the truth. Throughout the evening, small incidents highlighted the doctor's deception. He misidentified medications, hesitated when discussing standard procedures, and seemed unusually concerned about what the nurse was noticing. Each of these small mistakes added weight to her suspicion. The nurse stayed close to the patient and the dog, ready to intervene if necessary. As the night deepened, the hospital quieted except for the steady hum of machines. The nurse reviewed her notes and reflected on everything she had seen. The patient's subtle reactions, the dog's warnings, and the doctor's inconsistencies painted a clear picture. The patient's life had been put at risk by someone who should have been protecting him. She had to stay alert, protect him, and ensure the truth was revealed. The dog shifted slightly, placing its head near the patient's hand. The patient twitched slightly in response, his weak eyes closing for a moment. The nurse leaned over and whispered, "We won't let anything happen. I promise." At that moment, a discreet call from hospital administration confirmed that military authorities were being contacted. Verification of the doctor's service record was underway, relief mixed with tension. The nurse knew that once the truth was confirmed, action would be taken. But until then, she had to remain vigilant. She stayed with the patient, monitoring his vitals, and keeping a careful eye on the doctor's movements. The dog remained alert, a silent sentinel. The patient's weak gestures and quiet signals communicated trust and reliance. The nurse felt a profound sense of duty, understanding that her attention, awareness, and quick thinking could make the difference between safety and harm. Hours passed. The doctor became impatient, attempting to assert authority while unaware that his credentials were being investigated. The nurse maintained composure, guiding the patient's care and keeping a protective presence near him. Every movement, every interaction became a silent battle of awareness and vigilance. Finally, authorities discreetly arrived at the hospital to verify the doctor's credentials. The nurse observed from a distance, ensuring the patient and dog were safe. The dog's protective stance never wavered. The patient's trust in the nurse and the dog had created a bond of vigilance and loyalty that could not be broken. The verification process revealed the truth. The doctor's records were falsified. He had never served in the military. His badge, his story, his attempt to gain access, all were lies. The nurse felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Her instincts had been right. Her careful observations and attention to detail had kept the patient safe. When the authorities confronted the doctor, he tried to maintain composure, but the evidence was clear. The patient, weak but aware, was shielded by the nurse and the dog. The doctor was removed from the premises discreetly, ensuring that the patient's security was maintained. The dog remained calm but alert, watching proceedings with intelligence and awareness. The nurse continued to care for the patient, monitoring his recovery and providing comfort. The bond between her, the patient, and the dog had grown stronger. The experience had taught her the importance of observation, instinct, and vigilance. Even in moments of fear and uncertainty, careful attention could make the difference between safety and danger. By the end of the night, the patient was resting more peacefully. The dog lay close by, protective but relaxed. The nurse reviewed her notes one last time, ensuring that every detail had been documented. She understood that her actions had not only protected the patient, but also upheld the integrity of the hospital and the safety of others who might have been at risk. The nurse felt a quiet sense of accomplishment and responsibility. She had been vigilant, careful, and attentive. She had listened to instincts, observed behavior, and acted decisively when necessary. The patient was safe, the dog remained a loyal guardian, and the fraudulent doctor had been removed. The night ended with a deep sense of relief and a recognition of the quiet heroes. The nurse who noticed the small details, the dog who sensed danger, and the patient whose subtle signals guided them both. Together, they had confronted deception and protected life in a world where appearances could be misleading and danger could be hidden in plain sight. And as the first light of a new day filtered into the hospital room, the nurse understood the true power of awareness, trust, and quiet courage. It was not always the loud or obvious actions that made the difference, but the careful observation, the willingness to act, and the trust in instinct and loyalty that ultimately ensured safety and justice. The morning light filtered gently through the blinds of the hospital room. The patient was awake now, his breathing steady, though still weak. The nurse had spent the entire night at his side, observing every movement, monitoring every vital, and responding to every subtle signal from both him and the dog. The dog, still vigilant, lay near the patient's bed, its head raised and eyes scanning the room. Together, they had formed a small circle of protection around someone who had no one else to trust. The hospital corridors were busy with the usual morning routine. Nurses moved quickly from room to room. Doctors checked charts, and patients shuffled into the waiting areas. But in this room, time felt different. It moved slowly, each moment filled with careful observation and quiet care. The nurse stayed close to the patient, gently adjusting his blanket, checking his 4 lines, and speaking softly. "Good morning," she said. "How are you feeling?" The patient managed a faint smile and whispered, "Better, thanks to you and him," gesturing toward the dog. The dog lifted his head and gave a small, approving wag of the tail. The nurse smiled, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. They had been through a night filled with uncertainty, danger, and hidden threats. But through careful observation, trust, and quiet action, they had protected someone who could not protect himself. The fraudulent doctor had been removed, and verification of his false credentials had been confirmed by authorities. The patient was safe, for now. As the morning progressed, hospital administration came to check on the patient and thanked the nurse privately for her vigilance. They praised her calm observation, attention to detail, and ability to notice what others had missed. She felt a sense of humility, knowing she had only done what anyone would have done if they had been paying attention. But the recognition reminded her that even small actions could have a huge impact. The patient's recovery continued steadily. He could sit up with support, eat small meals, and respond more clearly. The dog remained by his side, a constant source of comfort and protection. The nurse found herself developing a deep connection with both of them. It was a bond built on trust, awareness, and shared experience in a high-stakes situation. Throughout the day, the nurse reflected on the lessons she had learned. She realized that care was not just about medicine and procedures. It was about observation, instinct, and responsiveness. She had been able to notice what others overlooked, to read subtle cues, and to act decisively without causing alarm. The patient and the dog had guided her intuition, and together they had created a safe space in a world that could have been dangerous. The hospital's routine continued around them, but in that room, a quiet sense of triumph settled. The fraudulent doctor had attempted to deceive, to gain access to someone vulnerable, and he had been stopped. The authorities had intervened discreetly, ensuring that the patient's safety remained paramount. The dog had played an essential role, using its training and instincts to signal danger and protect its companion. And the nurse had remained attentive, careful, and steadfast, the human element that tied the pieces together. As the day turned into evening, the patient grew stronger, able to sit in a chair beside the bed and speak in full sentences. He recounted fragments of his story quietly, sharing glimpses of his background and the training he had undergone. He spoke of loyalty, discipline, and the bond he had formed with his K-9 companion. The nurse listened intently, aware that these details were important for understanding the patient's needs and history. "You've done more than just care for me," he said softly. "You protected me." The nurse shook her head gently. "No, you did that too. The dog and you both guided me. I just followed what I noticed." The dog barked softly, as if agreeing with the nurse. The patient laughed quietly, a sound that filled the room with relief and warmth. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. Later, the hospital administration, returned to offer formal thanks. They emphasized the importance of vigilance, attention, and careful observation in situations where appearances could be misleading. The nurse felt a sense of pride, but remained humble. She understood that her role was just one part of a larger system, yet it was a part that had made a crucial difference. The authorities confirmed that the fraudulent doctor had been arrested and removed from all hospital duties. They praised the nurse's careful observations, her trust and instinct, and her ability to recognize subtle signs that could have been easily overlooked. The patient, still recovering, nodded in quiet agreement. His gaze occasionally shifted toward the dog, and the dog's eyes met his with calm understanding. The nurse stayed with the patient until he was ready to be transferred to a secure facility for continued care. The dog remained by his side, a loyal guardian to the very end. The nurse held his hand briefly, feeling the trust and gratitude in that simple gesture. She knew that her quiet vigilance had made a tangible difference in someone's life. As the patient was moved, the nurse watched from a distance. She could see the bond between him and his canine companion, the loyalty and protection that had guided him through a difficult night. She felt a deep respect for the unspoken communication and trust between human and animal, and for the lessons it taught her about awareness, instinct, and the quiet courage required in moments of uncertainty. The nurse returned to her station, reviewing her notes one last time. She reflected on the experience, understanding that vigilance, observation, and attention to detail could save lives. The fraudulent doctor had been stopped, the patient had been protected, and the bond between the patient and his canine companion had remained unbroken. She had witnessed firsthand the power of awareness, trust, and quiet action. By evening, the hospital felt calmer. The nurse took a moment to sit quietly, reflecting on the events of the past days. The patient's strength was returning. The dog remained steadfastly loyal, and the nurse's awareness had ensured that truth and protection prevailed. She realized that her actions, though quiet and often unnoticed, had a profound impact. She smiled softly, thinking about the patient and the dog. Together, they had navigated danger, deception, and uncertainty. They had relied on instincts, trust, and observation. And in the end, they had emerged safely, protected by vigilance, care, and quiet courage. The nurse understood that true heroism did not always involve grand gestures or loud proclamations. Sometimes it was the small, careful actions, the attention to subtle details, and the willingness to act when others overlooked what was important. She had learned that lesson fully, and she knew it would stay with her for the rest of her life. As she prepared to leave her shift, she glanced back at the empty room. Thinking of the patient and his loyal dog, she knew they were safe, that the truth had been revealed, and that justice had been served quietly and effectively. The bond between human and animal, the trust and instinct, and the power of careful observation had carried them through the night. And as the doors closed behind her, she felt a sense of quiet pride and fulfillment. She had protected someone who could not protect himself. She had recognized danger where others had not. She had followed the signals of the patient and his loyal dog, and together, they had ensured safety, truth, and care. It was a reminder that courage, vigilance, and empathy, even in the smallest forms, could change the outcome of lives in ways that mattered the most.